Okay then, well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see you all. And just a little bit of housekeeping first, just so that I'm not misleading anybody. As I explained earlier to other people in the group, and you weren't there, Veronica, so I'll let you know this. Even though we kind of got a bit excited last time about Lancashire witches, when I took a sort of rational and cool look at it, I thought that really and truly that case is so complex and intriguing that it probably needs a separate session to really look into it. It's extremely complex. So
I agree with you on that.
Yeah, I've spoken to Steve about it, and we're quite happy to do it cooperatively, and Steve can deliver it. So yes. So what I'm going to be doing today is going to be a sort of a general look at the witchcraft persecutions in Europe and in England. I will keep referring back to England because England was, as you'll see, the English situation was very different from that in continental Europe. And the other thing, again, we're back to housekeeping, is so that everybody is forewarned. We will be going below the waist a bit at times, as in it's kind of fairly visceral and physical, and we will be talking about ideas about the body. So if you're easily shocked, you know, you might have to mute me for some of it, but I'll try not to be too scurrilous. Okay then, so I think with that we're ready to go. So to make sure you are in the right room, I'll introduce it properly. Okay, we got this?
There we go.
Okay then. So can everybody see this all right? That there's a slide there. Okay, so I've called this bit Witches and Glitches. When I was a postgraduate student quite early on, my supervisor, who was just a lovely man and very, very bright, told me to look out for the glitch, the strange thing, things that don't fit in a story, the things that make you say, what the hell is happening here? And he gave me the example of the Great Cat Massacre. And it might be the first time you've even heard of this. It took place in Paris in the 1630s. There was a great strike among apprentices who went rioting through Paris, and the thing that was really odd was that they went about killing cats. Now that isn't my favorite story because I love cats and I can't abide people who are cruel to animals, but it was such a notable part of this story that a historian, a French historian, looking at it, Robert Danton, said he knew straight away there was something really weird about this story, and his question was, but why cats? What was going on there? There's something more going on than riots due to strikes, about, you know, poor conditions and poor pay. And what it came up with is, looking through the testimony and the indictments, it did emerge that these cats were being killed as a protest against their master's wife. And this is how it all started. So it was a highly sexualized reference to the private parts of this man's wife, because she was said to have been unfair upon the apprentices that were meant to be under her care. And this really took off. So the Great Cat Massacre of Paris, it was seen for quite a while as something that was just part of a general riot. But when this guy started to uncover it, he discovered a whole layer of history beneath what appeared to be going on the surface. And that was, there was a culture here that was misogynistic, that was highly sexualized, that women were objectified to an extreme manner. And he said, when you're looking at history, when you're looking at evidence, look for the cats. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do today. In a way, the whole witch hunt thing is like the cat in the story. It's a very weird, a weird period in history, sort of any time between, I suppose, the 1450s and really, in some cases, to the mid-19th century. But the period that we'll really be looking at will be between 1500 and 1700. So if you find things that don't fit with the story, you know, just hold on to that thought, because it could be something you can take forward later on. Okay, so any historians looking at this period will ask questions. The right questions would be why? Why in the middle of the early modern period did populations of entire countries appear to go crazy and start accusing and destroying people on the basis that they were witches and performing maleficium or evil deeds upon their neighbours, or even it could be attempts upon local dignitaries, or even the monarchy itself. For example, King James I of England and the VI of Scotland was absolutely sure that witches were trying to prevent the landing of his wife-to-be, Anne of Denmark. As she sailed across the North Sea, she had some bad weather. So he was determined that this was actually the doing of witches. Why on earth would he think that at that time? And there's also the business of how were witchcraft accusations pursued? How were witches prosecuted and then punished? And does that give us any clues as to the why? Sometimes you can see when you look at all of the evidence that the how, that is the horrible and extreme punishments that were visited upon accused witches, do give clues as to why people could be hunted down in that way, and why the population would support that level of destruction of life. But sometimes not, because sometimes the why can lead to the how. And you'll see this later on. So I'm sorry to be sort of a little bit enigmatic there, but it starts to make sense. Okay, so I'm going to look at, with a broad brush, the situation in continental Europe and in the British Isles, mainly England, because in particular, the Scottish situation was very, very different from the English situation, mainly because King James was very familiar with people in the Danish court before he married his first wife. Obviously, he was James VI of Scotland, so his wife came to Scotland, and James VI of Scotland, the first of England, was very conversive with new ideas that were coming from the continent via the Danish court. And it might interest you to know that it's now thought by academics that the ideas that he brought back from the Danish court not only affected the way that witches were seen in Scotland, but travelled across the waters and can be directly seen in the Salem situation. Again, there's that idea of the devil being involved, which you might find surprising, wasn't always the case. In England, again, we've got a very different situation from continental Europe. Some things, if you look at the evidence, you may find very familiar, but, no pun intended with the familiar, by the way, but there was also a situation where the appearance of things like familiars are unique to England. The idea that witches had these companions who were avatars of the devil and whom you would consort with and even feed with marks on your body. That is unique to England. It didn't have that on the continent. However, ideas did travel from continental Europe to England, particularly the business of the compact with the devil. That is to say, you made a demonic contract with the devil to give you powers, and I'll be coming to that very shortly. Okay then, the setting for all of this madness. What we need to do is look at the context. Over the years, certainly since the 1970s, witchcraft and witchcraft beliefs have been within history, you know, taken seriously. Before that, not so much. Hugh Trevor Roper, for example, in 1969, was probably the last of the historians to say, look, this is not really that worth looking at. Even though he'd done a very short book on it, I think one assumes that he just got fed up with some of his colleagues rattling on about it. But from the 1970s onwards, you have scholars such as Anna McFarlane beginning to look at, you know, what the context for this witch hunt was. How could you explain it? How can you explain the accusations and the beliefs? They seem so far-fetched for people in the 20th and 21st century. Now, the point is that there are many, many theories, but the truth, as ever, is it's always somewhere between all of them. It's extremely complex, so I'm going to break some of that down so that you can look for yourselves at the setting in which this took place. And that really should give you some answers. Now, I don't know if you know this, but we had a little ice age going right back to sort of, as you can see, from the mid 1400s right up until I think the 1850s, yeah? 1850s. Yeah. Now, as you can see, looking at this graph, the little ice age, you know, the worst of it actually falls between about 1500 and 1700. And I hope you can see clearly that there is a sort of little block on that graph where it says little ice age. And this had a huge effect. Now, I know Steve has got this for a future session, the little ice age, because in of itself, it is a whole study subject and is really fascinating for its repercussions, really, and its impact upon the economy and the politics of the period. Now, in this little ice age, I don't know if you've ever come across mention of the frost fair that was held in the time of Henry VIII on the River Thames. The River Thames froze so solidly you could actually have fires on it. And there was a frost fair where people were not only skating on the Thames, but there were lots of stalls and things for sale and jugglers and entertainment and so on. And it was so solid, that ice, that they did actually serve cooked food with fires directly on the ice, which seems a bit risky to me, but obviously the Henricians weren't that worried about it. It was that cold. The impact, of course, of all of this ice and the horrible wet summers, I'm not sure if this is sounding familiar, by the way, this little ice age, is that there was a huge crop failure. That meant starvation for many. And it was also the situation that it was against a background where during the same time, the population doubled. So sort of post the plague, the Black Plague, was it? Known as the Black Plague, Black Death. Post the Black Death, during the after the plague era, there was a doubling of the population in England. And certainly things like inflation ran wild at the same time. So for example, in 1500, you could buy a loaf of bread if it was a penny. Then in 1650, it was sixpence. So bread, which was the staple food of all classes, but particularly the lower classes, was 6 times as dear as it had been in 1500. And if you think up to 1500, there'd been, you know, a time of complete economic stability, really. That is quite shocking. Wages over the same period fell by half because there were too many people pursuing the same job. In other words, there were greater numbers of people having a hard time. So you've got this growth in population, failure of crops, massive inflation, and the economy and everything that implies, including political decisions, followed it. So this little ice age was impacted hugely on life in that period. It was felt particularly in Northern Europe as well. So, for example, those in the Nordic lands of Scandinavia and so on were often sort of sent off on their travels. If there were crops failing year after year, you had to leave where you were living to go and seek a living elsewhere. You know, you needed to find accommodation, a job, or some sort of paid work. And so in this period, there was a great deal of vagrancy. Now, the problem with this is that at the beginning of the period, just coming out of a medieval period, sort of the 1400s was the end of the medieval period, really. And the beginning of what we now call the early modern era, there were huge changes in ideas about charity. Now, this was due to some of the issues that we'll look at later, but it's due to changes in religion, provision by the church, the rise of Protestant work ethic, and also the fact that some of the population becoming richer. In England, for example, there was a yeoman class that was doing fairly well, and the poor were becoming a lot poorer. So these changes in ideas of charity caused a great deal of problem for those that were very hard up, where they could previously rely upon help from the church. Post-Reformation in England, those resources simply weren't there anymore with the destruction of the monasteries and so on. At the same time, you have the poor laws coming in between 1598 and 1601, the introduction of the very first workhouses. And this, in a sense, it sort of gives you a picture of where relationships between the different social and economic classes were. The fact that they had to enshrine into law what the obligations towards the poor were. The richer people did not like the idea of having to turn down pleas for help, but at the same time they didn't want to be losing money, but they didn't want to be the bad guy either. So really the solution was to have poor laws where there was relief on the parish, but it did stipulate that, in that sense, that well, it wasn't the fault of the yeomanry. They supported these ideas in a different way. And in a sense, it foreshadows the same sort of attitude that you saw in the Victorian era, where you had, in fact, in that case, the middle classes being responsible for the upkeep of workhouses, but there was a defined gap between them. Okay, next one. I mentioned the Reformation. As you know, in England, there was a sweeping change, breaking with the Church of Rome and having the monarch become the head of the church in England. And it wasn't just in England that these things were happening, but it happened in that particular way. I think most of us know that with Henry, it was foremost that he wanted to marry someone else. And he wanted to get rid of Catherine of Aragon and install Anne Boleyn. There was more to it than that, though, because the support from that came from different angles. For example, there was the idea that, well, we don't have to give all this money to Rome, let's keep it for ourselves. But there was also the other notion of religion itself having to change and reform. So you had Martin Luther on the continent propounding ideas about, you know, in fact, the papacy was corrupt, the church was corrupt, and selling an idea that breaking away from this idea of priests being the only ones that can bestow the magic of spirituality upon the populace as actually a fallacy. And that, of course, led to Protestantism on the continent, which developed in a very different way from the way it originally did in England. There's a sort of idea, I think a myth, that when Henry broke away from Rome, England became Protestant. It most certainly didn't. Henry VIII wanted to get away from Rome for all sorts of reasons, not least of it money as well. He actually didn't like the power of the church in England, and he ensured that money came his way by destroying the monasteries, giving out the lands that were previously church lands to his followers, people that he wanted to reward. And of course, that meant that there was a breakdown in the issue of spirituality as well. Now, really, you have to understand the importance of religion in the early modern period to get just how difficult this was for people. It was incredibly difficult. Religion oversaw the whole of your life. There were holy days, which of course we now call holidays. You could be fined for not going to church during certain periods. And that carried on afterwards, actually, as well, because it was quite a good source of income. So people who wouldn't get up on a Sunday to go to church got fined, which is a nice income for the local church. Importance of religion in early modern period can't be overstated. If you have that, in a sense, taken away from you, in other words, first of all, the Pope was the supreme authority, but suddenly the Pope isn't. It raises a lot of questions, and it also means that the thing on which you stood as a rock became like sand. In short, people were upset. They were uncertain. It was terrifying. With the destruction of the monasteries as well, it actually took away quite a lot of the ministries that the monks had undertaken for people. So for the sick, there was a huge amount of herbal knowledge in the monasteries, of medicine and so on. Teaching literacy in some cases to some boys who were thought that, you know, in other words, it was possible for a poorer boy to pull himself up by his bootstraps, and that was usually done via the monasteries. But in particular, the care for the poor, that was gone. So you not only lost a huge amount of your support that was seen as quite secure because it was coming from an indestructible source, or so it was thought. There was also this idea of new approaches to spirituality to compete with. If you had been Catholic, as everybody had at one point, and Roman Catholic, then your understanding of spirituality was pretty much as you've been taught from birth. When that's ripped away and you're suddenly given new approaches, it's quite worrying. And, you know, people will question themselves, you know, not just what is it all about, but, well, what have I been taught so far? Is that all rubbish then? You know, did that happen? So it's very, very difficult. It was a difficult period for people, and that uncertainty certainly paid into some of the tensions around in communities, in neighbourhoods, but even at national levels, when it came to the witch hunts. Other issues around the changes to spirituality come about via new approaches to the role of God and man expressed. So, for example, the Protestantism was far more demanding of an individual in terms of their relationship with God. The individual was responsible in a sense, in a way that they hadn't been before. There hadn't been that much required. Provided within Catholicism that you'd followed the rituals of the church, you were fine, you were in there. The new approaches, particularly Protestantism as coming from the continent, was far more demanding and required, in a sense, the adoption of different ethics as well. I've already mentioned this idea of a work ethic, that you had to be, if you were godly, you were hardworking and so on. That wasn't necessarily great for people who'd been thrown off their land because of the change in the climate or because of crop failures or so on. So all of these things effectively serve to shake people up, to the core of their beings, actually. There were also legal changes that tell us a little bit about when witchcraft became a capital offence and when it was taken more seriously. Really, for a very long time, witchcraft itself wasn't illegal. It's not really until 1542, which to me seems quite late, under a Henrician statute, that witchcraft becomes criminal. And at that point, it was seen as highly problematic in terms of, well, you could be executed for a first offence, but actually it was never enacted. I'm not sure why it was never actually enacted, and it was repealed in 1547 under Edward VI. Now, in 1563, it became illegal again under Elizabeth, but 1563, in 1563, there'd been a plot against Elizabeth, and part of that plot had been the idea that the group involved were going to kill her with witchcraft. And there was considerable concern about it at that point because, the idea of killing the monarch, the monarch, was directly under God. If this is part of the struggle between good and evil, it's pretty risky if you don't want, the devil's agents, as they were becoming by that time, killing the monarchs. At this point, within the law, though, if you were just conjuring spirits, or saying that you were conjuring spirits, or performing some little folk magic, like trying to cure a sick cow, you were told off, you could be imprisoned or fined. It wasn't necessarily the fact that you would be killed. At that point, it was a capital offence if you had killed somebody by witchcraft. By 1604, however, under James, that changes. So you could get hanged because you were carrying out folk magic or conjuration or fortune telling, because that was being seen as, by that time, the idea that you were in league with the devil because your power could only come from the devil. Again, I'll come on to that. And it's also during that period, just after there, that's where the Lancashire witches fell foul of the changes in the law, because they had not realised that, as we will see, you could actually be killed. You could be hanged for admitting that you've carried out a curse or whatever. Okay, now at this same period, what else is going on in Europe? War. 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. Massive upheaval in Europe, huge destruction, lots and lots of people slaughtered. War always hits the poor worse. And again, you've got a lot of people wandering around. And, this thing about vagrancy is it becomes easy to, if you're refusing charity and people curse at you, then something happens. It's easier to say, they cursed me, that's why this happened. It explains it away. Now, with war, the upheaval is such that must have been pretty extreme. And of course, you start questioning whether people have the power to do harm. You might even start questioning what the war is about. Now, people have linked, you know, a lot of academic scholars have linked the 30 Years' War with the heightened tensions around the witch hunts during that period. But I have to say that when it comes to England, the War of the Three Kingdoms, latterly known as the English Civil War, between 1638 and 1653, is peculiar in that fact, because in England, you'd be expecting in that case, if war is this promulgator of accusations of witchcraft because the world has been turned upside down, when the world is actually turned upside down during the English Civil War, actually witchcraft accusations start to grow less. So a war itself can't be held responsible for the tensions that lead to accusations of witchcraft, because in the English context, that just doesn't happen. In fact, after the 1630s, even the legal authorities are not happy about following up persecutions of witches. Now, this is when it gets fun. Sorry, it does go below the waist. It's pretty horrible, as you can see by the engraving. This is the introduction of the Diabolical Compact. Now, when I first heard that expression, I thought it meant a really bad face powder, but it's Diabolical Compact. It means a contract with the devil or demons who are his servants. At this point, instead of, and this is on continental Europe, at this point, what develops is this idea of the devil being behind all acts of conjuration and magic. And it started off in Switzerland in the 1400s. It was a continental invention. Prior to the 1400s, witches were not seen as agents of the evil one. They were people who could be good or bad, but they could use magic for maleficium, which is evil doing, or they could use it for good. It was generally thought, for example, that where you had injury to property or persons, then that must have been the devil involved. Anybody who had enough power to do injury to property or persons via magic must have got their power from the devil, because God wouldn't give you that power. Therefore, it must be the devil. And maleficium was this idea, this fear of maleficium was quite pronounced, particularly in rural territories. Now, if we go to, if we move away from continental Europe just momentarily and look at the situation in England, I mean, prior to 1800, 90% of the population of England lived rurally. You know, urbanization on a large scale didn't really happen until sort of between 1800 and 1850. On the continent, it's more or less the same. So you've got these huge rural areas where things like farming, crops are very important to people. So injury to property is seen as threatening to life and wealth and weal, because you relied on that. You know, if somebody made your cow sick, that meant you couldn't get milk for the following winter. You might have children in the house who needed that, or so, you know, that sort of fear was really, really important to people. The idea that you could actually do injury to persons was simply terrifying. And again, you cannot underestimate the sort of fear that travelled with this. In England, the Diabolical Compact didn't really come into witchcraft accusations. So things like mentions about broomsticks and flying to the devil's sabbat, which were rife in trials on the continent, were rarely mentioned in England at all. It was really, well, it's really well into the 16th century before witches in England become seen as enemies of God. And as you can see in the engraving, it was alleged that they made their contract with the devil by performing certain acts. And in this case, you know, you can almost see the caption on this with the devil saying, "Kiss my ass." You know, it really was believed that people would want to get power that much, that this is what the devil led them to. During the period between, say, 1450 and 1700, both across Europe and in England, there became the increased professionalisation of medicine, led by men. Now, those who had been in communities most knowledgeable about medicines were herbalists, who would be known usually as cunning men or cunning women. Cunning, in this case, being a derivative of kenning, that is, with knowledge or skill, not cunning as in crafty and bad. And so cunning men and cunning women would be the herbalists, the midwives, and the lying-in maids. And I know there's this huge issue about midwives being seen as, you know, witches, particularly on the continent. And there were quite a few midwives who were accused. Some historians have said, and I think amongst them Anne Barstow Llewellyn, Marianne Hester, that actually the professionalisation of medicine was a good way for the patriarchy to shove women out of the way. You can't let women have power over bodies. And as medicine became professionalised, and particularly studied in the universities in Europe, it was clear that male doctors didn't really want women being involved in medical treatment, particularly of mothers, infants, and so on. You probably heard the term, we even use it these days, don't we? Old wives' tales. The idea that women's knowledge is not real, but it's gossip and it will frighten you. Don't listen to old wives' tales. And it actually comes from that period. It was actually lying-in maids on the continent who were the most accused as witches, and who, far more than midwives, were the ones who were sentenced to death and executed. Now, the lying-in maids worked with midwives. Midwives was, that was the person who delivered the baby. The lying-in maids were occasionally employed on a monthly basis by women of higher class. In other words, when they had their period. They were responsible for cleaning the rags and looking after the lady of the house, because obviously working class women didn't have periods. Oh no. The lying-in maids around childbirth were responsible for all of the waste products of giving birth. So they'd be responsible for the placenta and the umbilical cord and so on. Now this, I mean, it's a very risky thing, being close to a woman, a pregnant woman, a woman in childbirth, when the risk of death in childbirth is so high. Because if anyone's going to be blamed, it's going to be those people who were most associated with her during her period of danger, which was, of course, the childbirth chamber. The lying-in maids were the ones who got messy. They were associated with the detritus of the birthing process. And it was believed that they could take away some of that material and use it to harm the infant by magic, or harm the mother. So that it's just an idea of sympathetic magic, using like as like, or using something associated with that person's body in order to curse them or to put a hex on them. Now, as you've probably gathered by what I've said about the changes in spirituality and the alteration around authority and religion, this had a different philosophy that was being brought forward. And it was during this period that you see a huge split between the body and the spirit. You had this idea that the body was lesser than the spirit. And that because women were more associated with the body, because we cry, we give milk, we bleed, and so on. The body was seen as, women were seen as being closer to the creatures, There were even questions as to whether women really had souls, you know, because we were closer to the animals. I mean, it's my opinion that animals have souls, so it wouldn't have bothered me. But certainly it did have a really nasty impact upon women. Spirit was seen to be above the body. It was transcendent and could be separated from the body. This causes a lot of problems, as you can imagine. If the body is not worth as much as the spirit, it's perfectly acceptable to damage, torment, and kill in order to save somebody's soul or spirit. And that certainly appears to have been the philosophy during the period of the height of the witchcraft persecutions. Again, particularly problematic for women, being seen as more of matter than of spirit. There's also this problem of dualism, this idea about the devil and God fighting out this supernatural battle between good and evil, using the earth almost as a chessboard, moving the people about in it. It does become a problem because dualism in itself would be problematic for the church. The belief that, well, if it's a battle, that kind of indicates that the devil could be as powerful as God. Otherwise, why would they be fighting? Why would God be always fighting him off? And that was something that really a lot of theologians wrestled with in that period. It was something that really preoccupied them. And while everybody was kind of uncertain about this stuff, it wasn't particularly good for the common people who looked up to the elite, particularly of the church and theologians, you know, to say, well, what are we to believe then? You know, everything else has been ripped away. What are we to believe? So this problem of dualism goes back and forth, as you'd expect it to. Again, making this a very unsettled period. Okay, so we're sort of looking at the how and the why, but we should also talk about the what. The manifestation of the persecutions varied quite a lot in country to country. Numbers who died because of the persecutions is thought now to be anywhere between 40,000 and 200,000 deaths in England, the British Isles and in Europe. And this is, of course, estimated. We will never know, mainly because many of the indictments and results of the trials are perished. A lot of the stuff we look at in the English situation comes from the assizes indictments that still exist from Essex and Middlesex. So it's quite difficult to know for sure. Some historians say it's probably nearer 40,000 than 200,000. It's certainly nowhere near the frankly ridiculous 9 million that was put forward way back in the 70s. And I think it was the neo-pagans, my own community, unfortunately, that were responsible for that little myth. But if you look at the demographics of that, it's you know, it divides up quite interestingly. In terms of class, you are looking at more people from the underclasses. If we can even talk about class at that period, we're talking about poorer people. It's obvious in England and on the continent that more people of the poorer end of society perished than those who were higher up. Age, the older you were, the more you were likely to be accused of witchcraft, particularly if you were female and you were living on your own, outside of the control of marriage and family, and seen as economically non-productive. Social standing, by that I mean reputation, which was really important in the smaller communities in which people lived during that period. Your social standing it meant a great deal to those people around you, and you know, it would losing your reputation could actually tear your entire life down. So it depended on your social standing. If you had gossip about you, whether true or false, about sexual impropriety in the case of women, for example, or unfair dealing, usually in the case of men, you were more likely to be accused of witchcraft and convicted and killed. Occupation, again, it's mostly manual workers, those who are out of work altogether, or as I've indicated to you, people who work with the body. You're more likely to be accused and killed, you know, convicted and killed if, according to your occupation. Gender is a biggie. In England, for example, I don't know if we got this on another slide. Did we put this down on the next slide? No, yeah. Okay, yeah. In England, 90% of those tried and convicted were women and 10% were men. But Marianne Hester has pointed out that of the 10% that were men, 9 out of 10 were directly associated with the women who had been accused and prosecuted. In other words, they were either blood relatives or spouses or lovers of those women who were accused. In Europe, it's pretty close. It's sort of 80-20 divide, female-male split. There was only one country, and that was Iceland, where you have 92% of those accused and convicted being male. And that is an enormous blip in the general picture. Now, a lot of this comes from sort of gender assumptions, really. There are lots of assumptions about about female roles in society and female body. It was noted as James Sharp, who's written the latest book, in fact, the first book on witchcraft in England, surprisingly. James Sharp says that it was notable that contemporaries, when writing about witchcraft and its dangers, hardly mentioned the fact that the majority were women. They just assumed they were. It wasn't even asked. It's one of those things that were unsaid. In fact, the only evidence that it became sort of raised as an issue is from William Perkins, who was an English theologian. And I'm going to read this to you. It's very short. And he says the reason that women are accused is because, and this is a direct quote, the woman, being the weaker sex, is sooner entangled by the devil's illusions with the damnable art than the man. And in all ages, it is found true by experience that the devil hath more easily and oftener prevailed with women than with men. His first temptation in the beginning was with Eve, a woman, and since he pursueth his practice accordingly as making for his advantage. For where he findeth easiest entrance and best entertainment, thither will he oftenest resort. And this is kind of interesting, this idea of the easiest entrance. And as I warned, we're going below the waist. The idea that the female body is more open to the devil is a direct sexual reference. The politics of the body in terms of women is that, you know, the body of the witch is essentially female. There were people who made a living out of going round pricking witches, is to say, pressing long needles into different parts of the body. And this was something that came from mainly Scotland and came into England. So there were ideas that the devil had sort of left marks on your body. And this goes along with the English idea of this familiar and little avatars or demons that disguise themselves as pets or farmyard animals. For example, you know, in the case of the Lancashire witches, it was Elizabeth Southern who spoke about, during her interrogation, poor woman, spoke about a cat called Pyewacket, which I think is a splendid name, and Vinegar Joe. These were all what she called her animals. And the thing is, she was probably suffering from dementia, but nobody really questioned that. The idea of familiars was particularly English, but it also feeds into this idea that on the body, these marks would be used almost as nipples to feed these familiars with blood, because that's what the devil demanded. The blood is essential life essence, and that's what the devil wanted. So women being searched would be searched for marks. So that might include things like any warts or moles or so on. I mean, I wouldn't have a chance, quite frankly. I've so many beauty spots, it hides my beauty, but I just wouldn't have a chance in terms of it being searched as a witch. Now, some of these could be skin tags, it could be anything. But what does really raise the question for me is that it's actually in the very late medieval period, and this is true story, that the clitoris was discovered by a doctor called Dr. Columbus. I kid you not. Now, presumably this came as some relief to Mrs. Columbus, who had known about it all along. But the fact that not many people realised, in spite of the notion that women had to enjoy sex in order to conceive, nobody seemed to sort of know a great deal about female sexual organs. And in some of those searches of the body, the clitoris became mistaken for other things. We're all made differently. Let's face it, we're all made differently. And it's the opinion of some feminist historians that even if that was the only mark on the body that the witch prickers found, that could lead to execution. It could be seen as proof that you had a familiar to whom you fed blood instead of milk. You're the bad mother, not the good mother, you see. So you could be accused and possibly convicted on that evidence simply because you were female. Now, the curse of Eve. You see, Eve was the person who gave in, wasn't she? As I've read out, William Perkins pointed it out, that the devil succeeded first time, not with Adam, but with Eve. Women are that gullible and they're easy to gain entrance to. And during this period in religion, certainly from the late medieval period onwards, Mary was extolled as the new Eve. In other words, she would do what Eve didn't. You've got Eve sort of giving birth to, brothers who end up fighting, one killing the other, giving in to the devil. So she failed. She disobeyed God. Mary didn't. From the beginning, she obeyed God. She was told that she was pregnant with the Son of God, and she didn't refuse. She said, thank you. She said, thanks very much, and became, if you like, the magic Christmas stocking that delivered the goods. And I'm not saying that in a nasty way, because I'm very, very fond myself of images of the Virgin Mary, even though I'm not a Christian. I think there is something rather wonderful about them. But this idea of a good woman and a bad woman certainly was a stick to beat women with, because you could never really succeed. In order to give birth as intended, apparently, you had to sin, have sex. Apparently it wasn't so much a sin for men as it was for women. You didn't aspire to be Eve because she lost the bet. You had to aspire to be something unachievable, a virgin mother. Now, this sexualization of the devil's influence and God's influence comes through when you see the highly sexualized punishment that some of the witches endured. And I'm kind of, if you like, a just a warning here. What I'm about to share is not particularly nice, but it happened and it's the truth. There were trials in Germany where women were sentenced first before being burned to be broken on the wheel. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that. I always thought it was a different version of the rack, but it's a horrendous punishment anyway, where you're strapped onto a wheel and your limbs are smashed with a sledgehammer. That was the first part of punishment. When it becomes sexualized is when the executioner actually cuts the breasts off of the woman concerned. And again, it's that moment where you think, what is going on here? The removal of the breasts was seen as, well, if you can't be a woman, we're not going to let you be one, because you've undone yourself by being in league with the devil. And in one particular execution, the executioner mocked the woman by holding her breasts up to her sons, who were also being executed alongside her, just to mock her and to mock them for drinking in evil from their mother. This is very, very sexualized. I mean, I know, I'm sorry, I do apologize. I know it's very shocking, but to me, it's the extreme example and an excellent one of how sexualized this punishment was. Now, I've already kind of mentioned this a little bit. We're going to come back to the gender thing. I know it's really horrible and upsetting, but if we could just move on to some of the other causes of people being accused of witchcraft, is this idea of the breakdown in community obligation, and it's known as the charity withheld model. Now, I've spoken about in England the rise of the yeoman class, who were doing quite well during this period, as opposed to poorer people who were being thrown off the land. There were lots of enclosures, for example, going on in the early modern period, where landowners threw people out of tied cottages or tied huts or hovels, whatever they lived in. Took away the land that they'd grown, you know, little kind of vegetable garden. They might have had a little market garden as well. They threw them out of the land and they were homeless. And so some classes in society were doing very, very well. But when it comes to people asking for charity, they didn't feel beholden, in other words, to be that charitable. And this idea of turning down someone who arrives at your door, somebody like particularly an old woman who's been thrown out of her home, has no one to support her, coming to the door, maybe asking for work, maybe asking for a glass of milk or a bit of bread. If you say, no, go away, we haven't got any work here, and I'm sorry, I can't feed everybody, that woman is sent away. Maybe in extremis, she might say, you know, then I wish you and your family no good. Or they might say nothing at all, but a few days later, something happens to one of your animals or one of your family. A lot of historians use this as a main cause, in fact, of witchcraft accusations, holding that things like tensions of transiting from the age of charitable concern, where charity is seen as a Christian obligation, to the idea where to a point where you don't have to give charity, you know, for the sake of your own income, your own family, you withhold it. That this is a main cause of accusations. There certainly are many of them. But as we've seen through a lot of, you know, the slides that I've shown you and lots of the different causes I noted, that on its own isn't really enough to explain the sexualized and highly gendered and highly classed terms under which you could be accused. I mean, there's also the issue of, you know, that the disabled or disfigured people could also be accused. Again, you're looking at economic viability. as well. So it's not, it might not be a case of just charity withheld, but there are some historians who, you know, hold on to that model and use that as an explanation. I would say, having looked over it considerably, that it is one cause of a quite complex situation. It does bring you to the idea of, well, if this was all going on, why did it stop? And as James Sharp says, when you look at all of the different causes or possible causes or putative causes of the witchcraft persecutions, the question is not why it happened, but why it didn't happen more. But the question of why it ceased actually might give us some answers to why it happened in the first place. There are different causes that are put forward by historians, and one of them is this idea of the breakdown of the great chain of being. This is a belief system where you have God at the top of this pyramid of being, followed by the monarch, who has a direct line to God, apparently, with the ecclesiastical authorities directly underneath, and then the nobles. Then you've got landed gentry, then you've got yeomanry, and then you've got, you know, the poorer classes and so on, right down at the bottom, holding all of it up. And, you know, say what you like about it, it's horrific, but you knew where you were. When that is broken down, as it is, I mean, typically England being the one that flouts everything else that's going on in the continent, it's after Charles I is beheaded. And in that way, you know, that is a huge breakdown in the great chain of being. It's after that that the witchcraft accusations are kind of lesser and lesser. But there is this encroaching enlightenment, the period where you stop believing mythos and come over to logos. In other words, you leave superstition behind and you move towards logic. And Enlightenment ideas spread right across Europe and came to the British Isles, to England in particular, in the period sort of beginning in the 18th century. But of course, the land is being laid down before then. Certainly in the English context, it's quite easy to see that the elite, and we're talking about nobles, magistrates, educated men, start requiring more evidence before they are even happy to consider an accusation of witchcraft being turned into an arrest and a trial. So they start requiring more evidence. There are books coming from the 16th century. I'm pretty sure you've all heard of Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. He's actually very skeptical about it. And, you know, he starts asking questions. Are we to believe this? Are we to believe that if God has, you know, made the whole world, that it would be possible that the devil still has the power to give humans power beyond what God decrees? And he also started, you know, he sort of raises in his book that those who believe this nonsense are just credulous and they're not educated. So the elite start to realize that if they give into these superstitions, they are seen as actually not very cool, not very educated, not one of the club. And I think that is one of the reasons why the elite start requiring more evidence. They want something concrete, solid. There becomes an active prevention of witch hunts. After the Lancashire witch trials, there's a problem that crops up in 1633, where an 11-year-old boy, I think his name was Edward Robinson, suddenly starts making accusations. He says that he saw a witch's sabbat. Again, something that came over from the continent, wasn't popular at all in the English witch hunts. He says that he saw this again in Lancashire. This time, the bishop and several local church representatives were alarmed about this. They didn't want to see a reenaction of what had happened in 1612. So they actively prevented this from getting any further, and eventually the boy admitted that he'd made it up. Now, had that been sort of 20 odd years earlier, you know, that might not have been that ending. So within that period, the attitudes towards witchcraft have changed quite a lot, really. And also there's the objections of the commons, as I've called it, the common people. The common people started to fight back, even though many of the accusations on the continent were from actually common people, coming from probably neighbourhood tensions and local tensions, or even a fire and brimstone creature in the vicinity. In England, it was actually, yeah, a lot of accusations came from the commons, but you had to pay to take a witch to court. And a lot of common people didn't have that. So they'd have to get the agreement of somebody or the support of somebody who did have the money. And if that person's actually now in the situation where if they give in to that, they're considered as not particularly part of an educated elite, that's not going to happen. But there were other ways in which the commons objected. And one of them was by petitions. And there is an example in Yorkshire. I'm just going to find my little note. Okay, it was somebody called Elizabeth Henriksen and her husband, who had been imprisoned in the prison in York after being accused of witchcraft. And 200 signatures were placed on a petition and sent to the assizes at York. And the Bishop of York actually supported the petition, and they were freed. So there's other evidence as well in the English context that local people got together and wrote petitions and signed them, saying that the people accused had never done anything that seemed to be unchristian. And therefore they had a good reputation locally. Their social standing was such that they were respected by their neighbours. And this was enough in some cases, in many cases, to actually free the witches. I don't know about you, but whenever I think about the term witch hunt, I do think about if one person gets you know, accused, that leads to them pointing the finger at others, and it's almost unquestioned. It just goes on and on and on. But in fact, you could turn the tide, you know, even if you weren't that powerful, if you could get as far as making a noise about it and attracting the support of somebody with moral authority, you certainly could change things around a bit for those who were imprisoned. In one case, I know in Germany, there was a family actually got compensation because the matriarch of the family, who was a grandmother as well, had been tortured during her interrogation. Now, they didn't get compensation for the torture. What they got compensation for was the fact that the loss of her work and her labour. But they did manage to get the court to say, no, she wasn't a witch, and actually she shouldn't have been tortured, and we want compensation for the fact that she can't do her work anymore. So it was possible sometimes to turn things around. Okay, very briefly, because I know time's getting on. Witchcraft in the 19th and 20th centuries. So in the late 19th century, there were revivals of interest in magic. In particularly, I'm thinking about groups like the Golden Dawn, who included, for example, the infamous Aleister Crowley. There were revivals, the idea that witchcraft was alive and kicking. And this was influenced, in turn, influenced Margaret Murray, an anthropologist in the 1920s, who is looking at witchcraft beliefs in Europe, and puts forward the notion that those who were accused of witchcraft on the continent during the period we've been looking at were all part of a pre-Christian religion. It was all part of a pre-Christian cult. And again, sort of present day pagans quite like this idea, you know, that we come from this and we're all victims of that and so on. There isn't a great deal of evidence that could hold that up. A lot of the evidence that she uncovered was actually obtained under torture and can't really be relied upon, but she certainly she kind of squared the circle a bit with it and said, well, this is a cult. And although her work was kind of highly respected at the time, it certainly encouraged people coming out of the revivals to look again at our past, and certainly look at witchcraft as a living thing, as something that perhaps our ancestors were into, and it would be nice to revive it. For the 20th and 21st century myths that still pervade around witchcraft, I'm a Wiccan, so I'm going to hold my hands up to this. A lot of my co-religionists, you could say, do actually believe Margaret Murray's idea that there was a universal pagan religion before the witch hunts, and that what wiped it out was Christianity coming after it. Not strictly true. That is a whole nother story. It's not true. The academic pursuit now is, there's a huge amount of academic interest now compared to when I started looking at witchcraft, you know, in Europe and Britain and America. Whoa, way back, definitely in the past century. There's a growth, it still continues, and I really welcome it, into looking at what it can tell us. You know, if you study it, what can it tell us? Can it teach us anything? Will we understand any more about what our ancestors did? Because we can't keep thinking they were all nuts, they were all crazy, they were uneducated bigots, because it kind of puts us in the clear in a way, doesn't it? It's saying we're better than that now. All our ancestors were stupid. They weren't stupid at all. Our society now wouldn't be possible if our ancestors were all stupid. What might seem crazy to us now, and certainly seems utterly inhumane now, made sense to them, and for that reason it's worth exploring. Of course, I have to mention popular culture. Yeah, there's still witches with warty green faces that come out at Halloween. You know, I don't mind that at all. It's great that people look at the idea of the monstrous. Does give quite a strange idea about witches, though. I haven't turned green yet, only when I get seasick. But popular culture still promulgates this idea as the witch as a woman, usually as an old woman, old and decrepit. And I use that much to my advantage when I sit out the front on Halloween, or as we call it, Samhain, in my rocking chair, in the dark, apart from a few scattered candles in my front garden when the kids come round. It scares the bejesus out of them, and I'm quite happy to use that stereotype in that way. Come from the school of pointless terror when it comes to educating children. Okay then, so the witch hunt phenomenon, what do we do about it? Well, you know, are there more recent cousins, the witch hunts? I'm thinking the McCarthy era, which were quite rightly called witch hunts in the 1950s, Reds under the bed, hunting the communists in the United States. The satanic abuse accusations of the 1980s, which turned out to be a frenzy over absolutely nothing. The witch children in contemporary Africa, we're looking at the Gambia, Uganda, etc., 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 Nigeria. This kind of still goes on. And I put a question mark there because I'm kind of opening that up to all of you really to think about or talk about, you know, can we see any of this happening now? Anything that kind of resonates with some of the causes and some of the events?
We go.
Right, I've shocked you into boredom, silence, or just complete horror. But,
that was brilliant.
I was painting with a very, very broad brush, so you could do an entire degree on this. You really could. And as I say, some of the cases, looking at things like Salem and the Lancashire witches, they really deserve a session on their own, definitely, to really get to grips with it, because they're fascinating stories. And I apologise for the horror story as well that I had to tell, but it was to make the point that a lot of these punishments were very sexualised.
Yeah.
Outstanding, Anne-Marie. You are amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. I think I had too much information in a way. I was
No, it was brilliant. I feel like as well, like when you were talking about it all, I feel like a lot of it is still in our society today. Perhaps not like witch hunts themselves, but you know, in terms of the hysteria around it politically, today, I think particularly with social media coming into play and connecting everybody,
yeah,
and giving people a literal tool to share false news and false evidence, whip it up into a frenzy. It's to the point where it actually influences our democracy. I feel like a lot of those same mechanisms that were going on then still exist, just in much more evolved forms today, really.
it does make you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, and when you were talking about the midwives as well, I mean, I know in my midwifery training, we were taught like it's like being a political activist to be a midwife, particularly from our tutors at UCLan, who were brilliant teaching us in that sense, because it really was going from that to going into the hospitals where it was so patriarchal. The power imbalance was huge, and you were fighting for women's right to just give birth, really, is what it felt like. So yeah,
I'm glad you've said that. Yeah,
it did really feel like that. And as soon as I saw midwives, I thought, of course, of course, because it's still to some degree goes on. There is still like a magic around midwifery in terms of working so closely with nature, and having that connection with a woman and the spirituality that goes behind it. It is very, very emotional and psychological rather than medical, pregnancy and childbirth, which I think gets lost in the medical system, really. But no, that was brilliant.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah,
I'm glad. I think if you can take something away from one of these sessions, it's a huge compliment to the person that delivers it. It's a huge compliment.
brilliant.
So when I was talking about the professionalisation of medicine, did that
it
ring a
made
bell then?
the mental health system as well, and how that's really not moved on that much ever. In terms of how it works and the evidence it's based upon it. I was thinking of that too, because I thought, really, these witches just sound like women who are emotionally and self-aware and who aren't afraid to use their voices either. And I thought, that to me is a healthy person, really. But it's yet today that is still not seen as a healthy person. That is seen as a person going against the norm or societal norms, and therefore they are odd. That still goes on today. So I thought we haven't moved on that much, really, when you get down to the nitty gritty of it. Like, I can understand where the hysteria came from, because I still see it going on today, really. Yeah.
I was thinking about the way that the storms, the storm that's whipped up around people on benefits and so on, it might be politically sourced, but it's been taken up by people that are actually in the same class as those who are accused. And that again, I can see that as happening, in that period, all that time ago in early modern England. And it's still happening, it's still that whipping up people against each other just for power.
And it is the power.
I wonder if it's that that internalized shame, that is, I'm not going to help you, whether because I can't or whether because I don't want to. But then what do you do with that shame? Well, you internalize it and then you send it back out. It's your fault. I can't help you because you're not deserving of my help. and it really feels like that. It's that othering, isn't it, that we do
Yes.
when we step over a homeless person. It's our
Yeah.
own shame that we've just stepped
Yeah.
over somebody. So it's much easier to turn around and blame them
Yeah.
you know.
Which is exactly what those historians hold, you know, say that actually that transition between the charitable and the, you know, non-charitable was a very difficult one to negotiate, and it became easier when you could actually say, well, it's not my fault, it's the devil using that person as their agent, therefore it's no longer my fault. But you're right, I mean, you can see that in the way that people do internalize shame and then try and shove it onto somebody else. And thank you for that. You've given me something to think about there, actually.
Yeah, can I just say, I always told my mum that in the past her grandmother would have been accused of witchcraft because they couldn't afford doctors and medicines. So they used to come to my great grandma with all their ailments, and she'd pick plants from the garden and make them into infusions. And some of them worked, some of them didn't. And I always think, because I am have an interest in this topic, would she have been accused in the past of witchcraft? Just because she was a bit of a herbalist,
It depends when and where. You know, it wasn't all the same all over.
Lancashire.
In Lancashire, right? If you were in Lancashire and you were doing herbs and things, she might have just been considered a cunning woman, because many people classed as cunning men or cunning women were never accused. They were seen as people who could take curses off, so they could be quite useful. The magistrates didn't really want to know about them. But if in the case of, I mean, has anybody heard of Edward Fairfax? He was like a big noise in the English Civil War. I keep calling it the English Civil War. The War of the Three Kingdoms, as my historical advisor tells me.
I've heard of Edward Fairfax,
Edward Fairfax, well, he thought that two of his daughters were enchanted or bewitched. And when he asked somebody of sort of the lower classes, you know, about, they came to him and actually said, oh, well, I know a bloke, and then I know somebody else. And it was sort of within a 10-mile radius that anywhere in Lancashire, you could find a cunning man or woman. So she might have been considered like that. If she was unlucky enough to be caught out, particularly if she was elderly and didn't have support, and she was, you know, carrying out these kind of little herbal cures for her neighbours, she would have been more at risk, in particularly after 1604, she probably wouldn't have stood a chance. Because you see, that's what happened to Alison Device. She cursed a peddler. In fact, she swore at him. You know, I curse all the time, but I don't get accused of witchcraft because of it. But because of that period, what she did was she cursed a peddler, John somebody, and I can't remember the name now. She wanted some pins, and he said, no, I'm not giving them to you. You know, quite rightly, I'm selling them for a living. And she said something to him, and then he had a stroke. I mean, it sounds like he had a stroke. And so his son wasn't happy about this and went and got her and said, now you tell him what you did, because the belief was that if you bewitched someone or you witched somebody, if you apologized and admitted that you were the person that did it, that undid the evil, and that was fine, you were quits. Now, what Alison Device did, believing this, was she said to him, yes, I did curse you, I am truly sorry for it, I hope you recover. But he didn't. And that's where she fell foul, because what she didn't know is that the 1604 statute made any confession of witchcraft a capital offence. That's why she hanged. You see, that idea that, you know, sort of, it depended where and when. If she'd done that much earlier, probably nothing would have come of it. Might have been a bit of a local upset, a bit of a spat. I mean, the families in that case who were at war, I mean, they weren't a wonderful lot. They really weren't. They would have been served with asbos, quite honestly. They were really not wonderful to live alongside. But she was just following tradition. And that's what got her. So it depends where and when in answer.
She was totally illiterate. She couldn't read or write or anything, but she could do her betting slips for some reason. But she did know, but she did know. And my uncle had a terrible stomach pain once, and she just felt his stomach, said, "Oh, he's got kidney stones. He'll pass it if I give him this." And he might have passed it anyway. And I've often thought, my mum thought she was marvellous, and I must say I do tend to put things on myself, like I would put witch hazel on a burn or something like that.
Yeah.
And I do, I do these things, or all sorts of things. Arnica, I would use arnica on a bruise.
Yeah.
So, but that doesn't make me a witch, does it?
No.
Where the medicine comes from.
No, I mean, we just, at one point, everybody had those sort of things in their kitchen. It was, and it was part of particularly a wife's duty to have those things to take care of a family. So, for minor ailments and so on, you had to have the knowledge of herbs. And so really, the whole witch hunt thing was not good for women, because effectively, whatever the kind of highly rationalist historians say, you could get done just for being a woman. Because eggs chopped up in a cup, don't start with that. He thinks that cures everything. He's from Manchester.
Hello. Yeah, me too. Where were you born, Steve? Yeah,
Where were you born?
Yeah. And milk, bread in milk, lobbies.
Bread in milk.
Yeah, bread and hot milk lobbies when you had a cold. I should. Yeah, that's why this cold hasn't gone, because I've not had any lobbies.
Oh, well, there you go.
And yet you look at other things like penicillin and morphine. They come from poppies.
Moldy cheese,
blue tree.
Yeah. Yeah, poppies.
These are glorified as modern medicine. We think that is just all of our medicine has.
Moldy cheese. They used to put moldy cheese on cuts, didn't they?
Yeah. I saw somebody, it was a very old man that I visited when I was a schoolgirl. It's a really old man. I went just as a visitor, and he thought me and my friend were my teacher's daughters, because she said, "Can I get some of my girls to come and see you and visit?" And he'd taken us when we were adults. We were just visitors, and he had this thing on his finger. His finger was really swollen, and he had a big piece of bread round it. It was like a bread poultice.
Yeah, my mother.
Do you know what? It took that infection right off. It was penicillin he was growing on it. It was horrible, but he actually...
they used to put some, when you pass your water first thing in the morning, they would put it, if you had a wart, you put it on, and it cures the wart in about 2 weeks. And I still do it, but it's uric acid, basically, isn't it?
Yeah,
Chilblains
of course it is.
as well. Yeah.
The only things that we still use.
I sometimes wonder if these women had some herbal knowledge or something. I don't know. It's only because of my mother's old witch grandmother, but
But I'm pretty sure they did. I mean, I think most people did, but it was usually the reserve of women. The preserve of women, to have that knowledge to protect their own family. Let's say something else then. Yeah. One of the things, and this might interest you, Claire, I've never actually read about this, but I did have this from a lecturer who used to teach me, and she used to teach history of ideas in the 18th century, and we did talk about the Enlightenment and the cessation of the witch hunt sort of after class, because she knew I was interested. And she said she had read somewhere that deaths in childbirth had risen after the witch hunts in Europe, because the knowledge that women had perished with them. And now I don't know how true that is. It does make sense to me, but I haven't, you know, being pedantic and being a recovering historian, I haven't, still recovering. I haven't actually seen that evidence. I'd like to see the documentation myself.
When you look into modern medicine, I mean, I know I did my assignment on one element of midwifery. I won't say it like publicly because this is recorded, but the evidence base upon which this policy was based upon, it was one incredibly flawed study, and that was it. This really common thing that is done in midwifery, and it's a medical intervention. It's not midwifery itself, really, and that's quite a common thing when you look at modern medicine and unpick the policies that everything's based on. Bring it down to the studies, it's all aimed at preventing stillbirth, but by interfering more and more and more and more and more, actually, and especially in the likes of America, where it should be safer to have a child because it's a Western culture, when you look at it, the stillbirth rates are still high. Over here, I don't know what they are now, but you know, we still don't have a zero or very small stillbirth rate, considering that we're meant to be better off now with all these modern interventions, and a lot of that is thought to be because of we haven't got enough midwives. There's not enough midwives for women, and all of that history, that connection, that knowledge of the relationship between a midwife and her woman who is in labour, that is all lost. The emotional and spiritual side of midwifery is lost, and all that's left is the physical, and the physical isn't enough to keep it safe and keep it what it is meant to be, which is this incredibly natural, incredibly emotional event, really. And you can see that in the first year postnatal, where the leading cause of death for women is suicide now in Western medicine. And it's just, I do feel it links strongly to what you've been talking about tonight. It goes back for so long, because all of these attitudes don't just go away, they just stay with us and just manifest in different ways. And it's, midwifery was a really interesting course to do, because it really was so historical and so political, and such a role that was so powerful but at the same time so powerless. It's a huge responsibility to try and be a midwife in today's world, really.
That battle's been going on for really since the 1970s, and because I can remember it myself, you know, having the kids sort of towards the end of the 70s, that there was a great, I mean, actually I was really pleased when I found that one of the modules that I taught in women's studies, when we had women's studies, was women, myths and realities in the 20th century, and later on I taught women, myths and realities in the 19th century. But my favourite thing about teaching that module was that all of the midwives used to have that as their elective. That was their elective module. They did the midwifery course, and they don't do this now, but you could choose one each year of any, for the first 2 years, any elective. And they all came along to mine, and they were the most militant women I'd ever met. And I was always pleased when they turned up in that module, because I thought, oh, we're going to have some lively discussions now. And they were always good, and they always contributed very strongly. But I remember myself, for anybody who gave birth in the 1970s, that there was a huge battle really going on between male obstetricians and midwives, who were mainly female still in the 1970s. And you remember that with your kids as well. Yeah, you had to really fight. I mean, and you had to support the women as well, because I remember sort of, you know, you had to go in, shave, have an enema, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And the whole process was so unnatural. You know, you've got to lie down, you don't move. And I said, no, not doing like that. And I brought my own pillow in, and I brought, you know, and actually between 1978 and 1983, there was such a sea change in how midwives were seen, because I had my last child in 1983, that I sailed into the hospital. Nobody asked me to do anything or forced me to do anything. it was so much better. The whole experience was so much better, and it was conducted all by women.
Yeah.
That was the difference as well, that it was all by women. Not that you don't get grumpy, horrible old midwives, because I'm sorry, but you do. I've seen them at work with my daughters. But it was, yeah, these things, when you raise them in a historical context, I think it almost discloses it more. In a modern context, you know, contemporary context, you start seeing things.
Yeah, because
it really brought down women's. It's like this was, you know, these were women's places. It's a place where, you know, women met, where they were together, where they had a great deal of, you know, where they had the power together, and it actually broke all that.
Yeah.
And
yeah, confinements were really joyful, weren't they?
Yeah. But it also meant that women came together in community, and they birthed each other's children, and they knew it. So they were in, you know, it was a women's place, and they had a lot of power in that place, and therefore outside of it. And I might be a cynic, but you know, for me, it was about breaking that up. You know, again, it's patriarchy. And it's that if you break these spaces up, then again, we're moving more and more and more towards, you know, the kind of, you know, the 2.2 family or whatever it is, where, you know, we're dividing communities again, but particularly communities of women. Because, you know, we can't. And I do think that was on, but also what you were just saying about, you know, giving birth in the 1970s, again, it's about dehumanizing. It's about disempowering, you know, it's kind of giving, it's not about anything to do with, you know, giving birth.
I know what you mean.
It's a political process. And although women are now kind of in some senses able to reclaim some of that, in that midwifery has changed, it's still within and medicine has changed, it's still within a patriarchal system. It's still dictated and directed by, you know, so resources, and you know what I mean, and economics, and you know, and what you can have and what you can't have. And so we've really lost that, which was kind of, it was our arena as women.
It was only 6 years ago I trained. Only 6 years ago, 2015.
Yeah.
And even then, it was like, we are meant to be more like Call the Midwife. People think Call the Midwife is this weird little, you know, like, oh, it's never like that. When actually, that's how it needs to be. That's how it should be, and that's how we were trained. But the polar opposite goes on in hospital.
In the hospital, once you get there.
There's such a movement to get it back to that, and to get women truly at the centre of their care again with midwives. But it's massively political. But then I think all the were purely political.
Yeah.
Actually, I remember having a scan, and I was upstairs on the 6th floor, had my scan, and they put the results and they sealed it down and said, take this downstairs to the ground floor, but you're not allowed to open it. So
oh, really? Your own body?
I got in the lift and I opened it up and I read it. I mean, it didn't mean an awful lot to me, but yeah, I read it, and then I handed it over, and they looked and they could see that I'd opened it, but they didn't say anything. But you tell me not, it's my baby and my body, and I just had the scan and I wasn't allowed
it's
to.
Outrageous.
And this was 1983. But
it's outrageous. But
in 1986, when I had another baby, they just handed me the thing and said, take that down.
Yeah, it changed, didn't it? I mean, it was really weird. But one of the things that's sort of coming out of interest in the comments that I'm getting is that the thing that people don't understand about patriarchy, it's not men against women, because there are, for example, in hospitals, there are some women who collude with these practices And whether that's because it makes their life easier, or whether it's because they've internalized their own oppression, it's still the fact that some women will go along with it and be part of it. And one of the things that was brought forward to me and I've read quite a few objections to the gender theory, which to me is not a theory, it's a fact. You can't ignore not only the statistics, but the actual means by which witches, women, were prosecuted and punished. It's the fact that some historians just say, well, yeah, if it was like patriarchy driving this, why is it that particularly in England most of the accusers were women? And I thought, well, that's because you don't understand patriarchy. You know, it doesn't mean men only accuse women, therefore it is a gendered thing. It's a case of women are as much subject to their own oppression as men are within patriarchy. Everybody suffers from it. And it's actually during sort of those movements of feminism early on, certainly in the 60s and 70s, where women had to, one of the first things you did was had to raise your own consciousness about it, which a lot of people saw as navel gazing, but actually it was about getting rid of your own prejudices. And there's also the fact that was kind of missing from these historians' argument is that actually, you know, there were also men who were fighting against this. It doesn't mean to say that you can't then use this idea that patriarchy was a part of the problem. You can't disabuse me of that if you don't actually understand what patriarchy is. But that is actually genuinely, even now, used by some historians as an argument against the gendered nature of the witch hunts. They said, well, no, it wasn't gendered because women accused women. Obviously, all gossiping and bitching about each other. That's what happened. That's why it all went horribly wrong. You know.
That's how I question their self and emotional awareness. So I'm like, good Lord, if you had any understanding of how people work, it doesn't matter if the man.
Exactly. I mean, can you imagine any woman watching those executions are basically being told, this is what will happen to you if you don't collude. That doesn't matter whether it was conscious or not. That's the impact.
Yeah.
No, it's not as if.
And you ask as that enough to be accused of witchcraft and to have been killed. Therefore, I will turn on anyone who goes against social norms, even if I'm a woman, to protect my own life, kind of thing. It's not hard to understand, is it?
Not really, no. I wouldn't have thought so. You do get people. I've had stand-up fights with Ronald Hutton over this. I mean, I do read his stuff, but
fear rules everything, doesn't it? In our society, it is ruled by fear.
Yes.
Yeah.
People will do what they will do.
Still is. Yeah, still is.
Can I just ask you to define cunning women, please?
Cunning women.
Just because
I don't know
I am going to tell my
go.
siblings about a cunning woman and not a witch. So can you just...
you've put me on the spot now.
Absolutely. Okay. I'm really good at that.
Okay, somebody who's knowledgeable about herbs and magic and would be more likely to be asked to undo charms. So they could do charms themselves, but they would be asked to undo malefic charms, you know, evil charms. You haven't said anything. Have we not let you?
No, I'm being oppressed.
Being oppressed.
I was doing the webpage.
Oh, I mean, it's really interesting. It's been really good.
I'm going to put Anne-Marie as how often do you do a session, Anne-Marie? Are you enough to be a co-host or
no, definitely not.
So
definitely
are you
not.
Guest host?
When she feels like it.
When you've got an
Don't
expert.
tie her down.
I'm going to put Steve's our host, but with the occasional guest host by Anne Marie.
No,